The MMA community is absolutely losing it. The main event of UFC Abu Dhabi was supposed to be a statement: Magomed Ankalaev's return to title contention after losing his belt to Alex Pereira. What they got was a 5-round snooze fest that had fans booing and fighters calling for the division to be saved from boredom and monotony. Brunson summed it up perfectly. The light heavyweight division needs some life. Paulo Costa, the man who calls himself the killer of Russians, is already positioning himself to save the division. And if that wasn't enough chaos, the UFC just revealed the full card for UFC Paris. And it's a banger. Salahdine Parnasse is finally making his UFC debut against Dan Hooker in the main event. Michael Venom Page is fighting in Paris. The French fans are going to go insane. But the real story is Ankalaev's win and why nobody is celebrating. This is the story of a comeback that made everyone cringe, and a Paris card that might actually deliver what Abu Dhabi couldn't. The main event of UFC Abu Dhabi was supposed to be a statement. Magomed Ankalaev, the former light heavyweight champion, was returning to the octagon to remind everyone why he deserves another shot at the belt. His opponent, Bogdan Guskov, was a dangerous contender looking to make a name for himself. The stakes were clear. A win for Ankalaev would solidify his position as the next challenger for champion Carlos Ulberg. What the fans got instead was a 5-round slog that had the Etihad Arena crowd booing and fighters calling for the division to be saved. It was the kind of fight that makes promoters nervous, and fans wonder why they spent money on pay-per-view. The opening frame set the tone for everything that followed. Very little action. Cautious circling, feints without follow-through. The second round was largely uneventful aside from Ankalaev securing a clinch and landing a few knees. The lack of output continued into the third, prompting the restless Abu Dhabi crowd to loudly voice their frustration and shower both men with boos as they returned to their corners. This wasn't the Ankalaev who had dominated the division. This was a fighter who looked hesitant, unwilling to engage, content to win on points rather than make a statement. The championship rounds finally brought some urgency. Ankalaev shifted gears in the fourth, immediately taking Guskov to the mat. He worked his way to full mount before settling into half guard, eventually threatening with a rear naked choke that Guskov managed to defend. It was the first time the fight had any real drama. But even then, the action was sporadic. Guskov, who landed just 45 strikes throughout the entire fight, nearly pulled off a miracle head and arm choke early in the 5th round. Ankalaev calmly escaped the sudden submission threat and eventually took Guskov's back. Despite a brief reversal from Guskov in a desperate scramble, Ankalaev regained top position and unleashed a vicious barrage of blows to force the stoppage at 2:41 of the 5th round. The victory gave Ankalaev his 13th UFC win, the most among active light heavyweights. On paper, it was a statement. In reality, it was a nightmare. The crowd booed. The analysts struggled to find positive things to say, and the fighters who were watching cage side had opinions that were anything but kind. Paulo Costa, who has made a habit of calling out Russians since his knockout of Azamat Murzakanov, wasted no time in delivering the most brutal assessment. "With God's help, I will save this division from boredom and monotony," Costa wrote on social media. The killer of Russians versus boring fights. Costa, who calls himself a specialist in fighting Russians after back-to-back wins over Roman Kopylov and Azamat Murzakanov, was positioning himself as the antidote to what he saw as a dying division. He had previously expressed interest in fighting Ankalaev for an interim title, while champion Carlos Ulberg recovers from a torn ACL. His comments were a direct shot at Ankalaev's performance, and they resonated with fans who were already frustrated. Brunson, who fought 21 times in the UFC over 11 years before moving to the PFL, summed up the sentiment perfectly. The light heavyweight division needs some life. Brunson had moved up to light heavyweight after leaving the UFC, and he was watching the same fight everyone else was. His assessment was blunt. The division was in trouble if this was the best it had to offer. The comments from Costa and Brunson were not isolated. Social media was flooded with reactions from fans, analysts, and fighters who were all saying the same thing. Ankalaev's win was a win in name only. He had done what he needed to do, but he had done it in the least impressive way possible. Watching the grueling affair cageaside was reigning UFC light heavyweight champion Carlos Ulberg, who is currently sidelined while recovering from a torn ACL. With the stoppage victory, Ankalaev likely solidified his position as the next challenger for Ulberg once the champion is cleared to return to the octagon. But after a performance like that, the question is whether anyone actually wants to see that fight. Ulberg is an exciting champion. He finishes fights. He entertains fans. Ankalaev just showed the world that he can win without entertaining, and that's a problem. The good news for fans is that the UFC Paris card is packed with the kind of entertainment that Abu Dhabi lacked. The bad news is that the light heavyweight division now has a contender who might be the most boring fighter in the title picture. The next chapter of this story is about the Paris card that might save the sport from the monotony that Abu Dhabi just delivered. And it starts with a French superstar who is finally making his UFC debut. While the MMA community was still recovering from the Ankalaev snoozefest, the UFC dropped a bombshell that immediately shifted the conversation. The full card for UFC Paris was revealed during the UFC Abu Dhabi broadcast, and it's an absolute banger. The French fans are about to get exactly what they've been waiting for. A homegrown superstar making his UFC debut in the main event. And the best part? It's happening in front of a crowd that will be raucous, passionate, and ready to erupt. Let's start with the main event. Salahdine Parnasse, the former KSW featherweight and lightweight champion, has finally signed with the UFC, and he's not getting a quiet debut on the prelims. He's headlining the entire card against a veteran contender. Parnasse, who has long been regarded as one of the best fighters outside the UFC, will face Dan Hooker in a 5-round lightweight bout at UFC Fight Night 287 on September 5 at the Accor Arena. The fight was announced during the UFC Abu Dhabi broadcast, sending shockwaves through the MMA world. Parnasse is 23-2 and riding a 5-fight winning streak. He has 8 knockouts and 7 submissions on his resume, and he's finished 22 of his 23 opponents. That's an 88% finish rate. He doesn't leave decisions to the judges. He doesn't leave anything to chance. He goes in, gets the job done, and walks out. His most recent outing was a first-round knockout of Kenneth Cross on the MVP MMA Netflix card in May, a performance that had the UFC brass paying attention. The French superstar has been on the UFC's radar for years, but negotiations always stalled. He was making more money in KSW than the UFC was willing to offer, reportedly earning 20-30 times less than his existing deal. But now the UFC has opened the checkbook. And the result is a French talent finally getting his shot on the biggest stage. But the main event isn't the only reason to be excited. The UFC Paris card is stacked with names that will have fans on their feet. Michael Venom Page, the British striker known for his flashy style and viral knockouts, will face Nursultan Ruziboev in a welterweight bout. Page is on a 3-fight winning streak with victories over Shara Magomedov, Jared Cannonier, and Sam Patterson since February 2025. He's one of the most entertaining fighters on the roster, and he'll be looking to put on a show in Paris. Ruziboev, on the other hand, is on a 3-fight winning streak of his own and ranked 15th in the middleweight division. He's a dangerous opponent who won't be intimidated by Page's reputation. This fight has fireworks written all over it. The French contingent is also well represented. Morgan Charrier is set to face Felipe Lima in a featherweight bout. Mathieu Letho Duclos will take on Luis Felipe Diaz at middleweight. Umar Sy is scheduled to fight Modestas Bukauskas at light heavyweight. Nora Cornol, one of France's top female fighters, will face Claudia Sigula at bantamweight. The French fans will have plenty of homegrown talent to cheer for. The full card also includes a bantamweight bout between Nathaniel Wood and Maron Santos. Lucien Keita will face Muhammadjon Naimov at featherweight. Curtis Campbell takes on Trevor Peake. Mario Pinto, a Portuguese heavyweight with an undefeated 12-0 record, will face Ryan Spann. This card has depth, it has star power, and it has the kind of energy that Abu Dhabi so desperately lacked. The contrast between the two events couldn't be more stark. UFC Abu Dhabi gave us a main event that had fans booing and fighters calling for the division to be saved. UFC Paris is giving us a French superstar in his debut, a British striker on a winning streak, and a crowd that will be electric. The lesson is clear. The UFC knows how to deliver when they want to. And in Paris, they're ready to remind the world why this sport is so compelling. While the light heavyweight division was busy being labeled boring, and the French fans were preparing for a revolution, the middleweight division was quietly tearing itself apart. Paulo Costa, fresh off his devastating knockout of Azamat Murzakanov at UFC 327, has been on a media tour that can only be described as unhinged. He calls himself the killer of Russians. He has demanded an interim title shot. He has mocked Magomed Ankalaev's snoozefest performance. And he is making it very clear that he intends to save the UFC from boring fighters. Costa's comments about Ankalaev have gone viral. In a series of videos, he laughed at the Ankalaev-Guskov fight, calling it uninspired and pathetic. He said that if that is the best the light heavyweight division has to offer, then the division is in worse shape than anyone thought. Costa's conclusion is simple. He needs to move up permanently and show everyone how it's done. With God's help, I will save this division from boredom and monotony, Costa wrote. He also called out Ankalaev directly, saying his boring style has no place in the sport. Costa's criticisms have sparked an intense debate among the MMA community. The fighters who watched Ankalaev versus Guskov in Abu Dhabi were largely unimpressed. Derek Brunson said, "The light heavyweight division needs some life." He specifically mentioned that if Ankalaev wants to be considered a true contender, he needed to dominate. Michael Johnson, known for his speed and power, pointed out that Ankalaev looked gun-shy and hesitant, which is unusual for a fighter known for his aggression. Citation: Ankalaev's hesitancy might be a sign that he is still adjusting to the weight cut, or perhaps he's suffering from ring rust. Regardless, he did not look like the title challenger he claimed to be. Now, the rivalry between Costa and Ankalaev is personal. Costa continues to call himself the killer of Russians, referencing his wins over Roman Kopylov and Azamat Murzakanov. He has made it clear that he wants to add Ankalaev to his list. This threat has brought a much-needed spark of life to the light heavyweight division. Costa is a fighter with a loud personality and a fan-friendly style. He will engage, he will push the pace, he will not back down. Of course, Costa has his own problems. He has been inconsistent in his career, with losses to Israel Adesanya and a controversial fight with Marvin Vettori. However, he has re-established himself with back-to-back wins. The UFC needs to capitalize on this momentum. The light heavyweight division needs a villain, and Costa is perfectly suited for the role. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the UFC Paris card is stacking up to be the most anticipated event of the year. Citation: The French fans are ready to erupt. The inclusion of Salahdine Parnasse in the main event has been the talk of the town. He is considered a national hero. The pressure is immense, but the reward is huge. The full card for UFC Paris is now taking shape, with Salahdine Parnasse headlining, Michael Page fighting, and a host of French talents on the undercard. The event is set to be a sold-out spectacle. Citation 3. The question is whether the card can live up to the hype. It has the potential to overshadow the disappointing Abu Dhabi card completely. The MMA community is in meltdown mode, and it's not just because of the Ankalaev Guskov snoozefest that had fans booing and demanding refunds. It's because the fallout from that fight has ignited a war of words between two of the most dangerous men on the roster, and the entire light heavyweight division is caught in the crossfire. Paulo Costa, fresh off back-to-back wins over Roman Kopylov and Azamat Murzakanov, has been calling himself the killer of Russians. He's been positioning himself as the savior of a division that he claims has become monotonous and boring. And after watching Ankalaev's lackluster performance against Bogdan Guskov at UFC Abu Dhabi, Costa went absolutely nuclear on social media. "With God's help, I will save this division from boredom and monotony," Costa wrote. The message was clear. Ankalaev's style doesn't belong in the title picture. Costa's style does. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Costa wasn't just talking trash, he had skin in the game. According to Costa, the UFC had approached him just 13 days before the Abu Dhabi card to replace the injured Khalil Rountree Jr. against Ankalaev. The offer? Same money, 5 rounds, short notice. A 16-hour flight to Abu Dhabi, and no interim title on the line. Costa rejected the offer, calling the UFC's approach disrespectful. "I think they push good talents away from them," Costa told Ariel Helwani. "They create a distance. They create beef between fighters and the guy who negotiates. We have seen this in the past. Francis was one of these guys. They pushed so hard, they pushed him away." Ankalaev, who watched Costa's criticisms from afar, responded with a challenge. "You talk a lot, but we both know you never want to fight me," Ankalaev wrote on social media. "If you're a real man, accept the fight and let's do it. Otherwise, keep your mouth shut. An interim title is fine with me too. No problem." The response was pointed, it was calculated, and it positioned Ankalaev as the one willing to back up his words with action. But there's a catch. Ankalaev is now the #1 contender for the light heavyweight title, currently held by Carlos Ulberg, who is recovering from a torn ACL. An interim title fight between Ankalaev and Costa would make perfect sense if both men actually agreed to it. The problem is that Costa seems to be taking a stand against the UFC itself. He has just one fight left on his current UFC contract. He has accused the promotion of deliberately keeping him sidelined to pressure him into signing a long-term deal. "I think they will not give me a fight if this is going to be my last. Unless I re-sign a long-term new deal," Costa explained. He knows his position, the UFC's position, and he is using every tool at his disposal to force a resolution. The Ankalaev-Costa feud is not the only chaos in the division. Alex Pereira, the former light heavyweight champion, has also weighed in. Ankalaev called out Chama, Pereira's nickname, saying, "There's someone who calls himself Chama," and said something like, "Are you still alive? Well, if he wants to come fight this fight, I'm sure the UFC would be happy to organize it." Pereira, of course, has moved up to heavyweight and is chasing a third belt. He won't be back at 205 anytime soon, but his shadow still looms over the division. And the fans are desperate for someone, anyone, to inject some life into the light heavyweight weight class. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the UFC Paris card is providing exactly the kind of excitement that Abu Dhabi lacked. Salahdine Parnasse's debut against Dan Hooker is already the most anticipated matchup of the year in France. Michael Venom Page is fighting Nursultan Ruziboev in what could be his final UFC bout. The French crowd is going to be electric, and the card is set to remind everyone why MMA is the most exciting sport on the planet. The contrast between the two events is stark. UFC Abu Dhabi gave fans a main event that had them booing and fighters calling for the division to be saved. UFC Paris is giving fans a French superstar, a British striker on a mission, and a crowd that will be deafening. The question is whether the light heavyweight division can find its own injection of energy, or whether Ankalaev and Costa will continue to snipe at each other from the sidelines. The MMA community is still reeling. Magomed Ankalaev's fifth-round TKO victory over Bogdan Guskov at UFC Abu Dhabi was supposed to be his statement, a return to form after losing his light heavyweight title to Alex Pereira 9 months ago. Instead, it was a 5-round slog that had the Etihad Arena crowd showering both men with boos. The opening frame saw very little action. The second was uneventful. The third was so bad that fans voiced their frustration loudly as the fighters returned to their corners. It wasn't until the championship rounds that Ankalaev finally shifted gears, taking Guskov to the mat, and eventually forcing a stoppage at 2:41 of the fifth. The victory gave Ankalaev his 13th UFC win, the most among active light heavyweights, but nobody was celebrating. The backlash was immediate. Derek Brunson, who fought 21 times in the UFC over 11 years, summed it up perfectly. The light heavyweight division needs some life. Paulo Costa, who knocked out Azamat Murzakanov in April and has been calling himself the killer of Russians, went nuclear on social media. "With God's help, I will save this division from boredom and monotony," Costa wrote. He wasn't just talking trash. He had skin in the game. According to Costa, the UFC had approached him just days before the Abu Dhabi card to replace Khalil Rountree Jr. against Ankalaev. The offer? Same money, 5 rounds. A 16-hour flight. No interim title on the line. Costa rejected it, calling the UFC's approach disrespectful. Ankalaev, watching Costa's criticisms from afar, responded with a challenge that has the MMA world buzzing. "You talk a lot, but we both know you never want to fight me," Ankalaev wrote. "If you're a real man, accept the fight and let's do it. Otherwise, keep your mouth shut. An interim title is fine with me too, no problem." Ankalaev doubled down in the post-fight press conference, saying he would happily fight Costa in Abu Dhabi in October, unless Costa is going to be running away. The response was pointed. It was calculated, and it positioned Ankalaev as the one willing to back up his words with action. The question is whether Costa will accept the challenge. But Ankalaev hasn't forgotten about Alex Pereira either. The man who took his title. The man who knocked him out at UFC 320. The man who has since moved up to heavyweight to chase a third belt. Ankalaev called out Shama, Pereira's nickname, saying if he wants to come fight this fight, I'm sure the UFC would be happy to organize it. It's a long shot. Pereira won't be back at 205 anytime soon, but the call-out keeps the rivalry alive and reminds everyone that Ankalaev hasn't forgiven or forgotten. While the light heavyweight division is drowning in controversy, the UFC Paris card is providing exactly the kind of excitement that Abu Dhabi lacked. The main event features Salahdine Parnasse making his long-awaited UFC debut against Dan Hooker. The French superstar, a former KSW double champion at featherweight and lightweight, has been one of the best fighters outside the UFC for years. He previously turned down a UFC offer because it would have paid him 20-30 times less than his KSW deal. Now the UFC has opened the checkbook, and Parnasse is getting the homecoming he deserves. The full card is stacked. Michael Venom Page, the British striker known for his flashy style, faces Nursultan Ruziboev. The French contingent is well represented with Morgan Charrier, Nora Cornol, Umar Sy, and Mathieu Letho-Duclos all on the card, and the Accor Arena is going to be absolutely electric. The contrast between the two events is impossible to ignore. UFC Abu Dhabi gave fans a main event that had them booing, a divisional crisis, and a winner who had to apologize for his own performance. UFC Paris is giving fans a French superstar in his debut, a British striker on a mission, and a crowd that will be deafening. The MMA community is still melting down. But at least one side of the meltdown is positive. The fans in France are about to witness something special. And the light heavyweight division? Well, that's still a mess. The countdown to UFC Paris has begun. The countdown to Ankalaev's next fight is uncertain. The light heavyweight division is in chaos, and the MMA community is watching every second. The question is no longer whether the division will be saved. The question is who will save it, and whether anyone actually wants the job.